happen isolated and separate in one little area, never affects anything. Well, when God's grace is dropped into people's lives, it automatically will ripple out, having this ongoing effect that sometimes we can't even see. But it continues to grow and go on and on and on. And then as other things, other bits of God's grace are added to it, the ripples grow and magnify, and they actually become waves. And those waves can get huge depending on how far they travel. And so we're looking at this idea of ripples. And to help us understand that, I want to tell you the story of a missionary. Now, this missionary story is going to start as an introduction, but I'm only going to tell you part of the story. And I'm going to pick it up and carry it on as we go through the points, because this missionary story highlights what we're looking at today. And as we look at this story, I want to tell you about a discovery that a missionary made in 2010. In 2010, there was a special outreach and focus that some missionaries were doing. They wanted to go to an area that, by all their studying, there might be 1 or 2 dozen Christians who had left the area, which is a highly forested area in the middle of the continent of Africa. It's in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And those people might have gone to a town and then come back, but for the most part, the villages were isolated. And in 2010, a missionary by the name of Eric Ramsey set out to go to this area, and he made a shocking discovery that completely confused everyone. Because they went and they had to fly to where they were going, so they went to the largest base for our Mission Aviation Fellowship, which is a missions organization that flies missionaries where they need to go. And they were able to get a bunch of Cessnas that were going to take them where they need to be. And it was all based in Kinshasa, and that's in Africa. And they had to fly for 2.5 hours to this little airstrip that was going to be their focus. And after getting there, they had to, after arriving, they reached their staging point, which is a little village called Vanga, and they hiked 1 mile to the Kwilu River, and then they had to cross this river, which is a 1/2 mile wide, and they did it in dugout canoes. So you have this team of missionaries in all these dugout canoes, and if you know anything about dugouts, they're not the most stable. But they all made it across the river. And then after that, they hiked another 10 miles to find the first village that they wanted to reach. And they thought, we are going to have a chance to share the love of God with people who probably have never heard the love of God. And when they walked into the village, they were dumbfounded. They couldn't understand it, because they walked into this village and they found a thriving church. And they proceeded to visit 8 other villages in the area. It was about a 34 square mile area that they visited. And in every village they came to, there was a thriving, growing, passionate church. And they're like, how is this possible? And the very last village they went to, they happened to walk in, and they came across something that completely confused them. And it was this building. And this building is a stone cathedral in the middle of the jungles of Africa that seats 1,000 people. And they asked the village, what is going on? How did all this happen? All these villages around you, they all have churches, and you have this huge church. He goes, yeah, but the church got too crowded on Sundays. They're like, what do you mean? Well, in 2008, we had all the villages that you visited. They were coming to our church, to our village, to have church here, but we ran out of room, so we decided it would be better to plant churches in all these villages so that they didn't have to walk for miles to get to church. They could just go to church where they are. And so this church is still filled, but now there's 7 other churches in 7 other villages. And it's kind of interesting, because each church has their own version of the gospel choir. Because they write their own songs of praise and worship to God, and then they have these sing-offs with the neighboring villages. They get together, and it's just this great time of worship where they're comparing their songs or learning songs. And the missionary's like, how is this possible? And the people kept referring back to something that had happened. They kept referring back to something that was going on, and they kept saying a name. But the missionaries weren't sure, because, yes, the trade language of this part of the Democratic Republic of Congo is French, but the name that they were saying wasn't French, and they weren't sure what it was referring to, and so they had to go back and do some research. But I want you to look at this picture, because in the middle of the jungles of Africa, a 10-mile hike from the major river, and rivers there are the major ways of transportation, and 10 miles from the nearest major road, so to speak, there is a cathedral made out of stone in the middle of a jungle that's packed to overflowing, where they had to plant 7 other churches just to keep the Christians in. And the new people who are getting saved. How does something like that happen? Well, it's the ripple effect of God's grace. If you guys know anything about a ripple, I love doing this I sort of love doing it and hate doing it all at the same time. You go to a lake or a pond and it's crystal clear and you have that reflection, and then you throw a rock in the middle and it ripples out and it ruins the reflection. But it's cool to see how the ripples just keep going and going and going. And even when they get to the bank, they don't stop because they start coming back. And it just keeps happening. And today we want to look at that whole idea about the ripple effect of God's grace and where it started. And as we go through the message, you're going to hear where this started. But this is the after effect. This is the very end product that was discovered. But we want to know where it all starts. And we're going to be looking at that as we continue our study in the book of Ruth. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Ruth chapter 2. And we're actually starting officially in verse number 13, and we're going to be looking through the end of the chapter. But I want to review. If you remember, Ruth was a Moabite widow. She wasn't part of the people of Israel. She had actually married someone who'd come from Israel to Moab because of a famine. And then he died, his brother died, his father died, and left a bunch of widows there. And her mother-in-law said, well, I hear that things are getting better back in Israel. I'm going to head back there. God's blessing is happening there. I need to go back there. And so Naomi says, I'm heading back. And her 2 daughters-in-law say, we will go with you. She goes, why would you want to come to a strange land where you have no family, you know no one, you don't even know the customs? Why don't you stay here? And one of them said, okay, I'm out of here. I'm going home. But Ruth said, no, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Where you die, I will die. Your God will be my God. And she said, I'm going to do this. And so Naomi, in her goodness that was poured into her, said, I will pass the grace on. And it was just a little pebble, because saying, okay, you can come with me, wasn't a huge demonstration of God's grace. But it was a huge demonstration of God's grace, because that started the ripple effect. And we're going to see how that continues. And then when they get to where they are, Ruth shows a little bit of a pebble of God's grace, because she shows respect to her mother-in-law. We talked about this last week. As she asked her mother-in-law, can I go get us some food? Can I work hard to get us some food to provide for us? But she was showing respect and honor. And it was another little pebble that was added, and the ripples started growing and intermingling. And we get to our story today, and I'm actually just going back up to verse 11. Because verse 11 is where the third main character enters the story. And he's actually speaking, and Boaz replied, and he's talking to Ruth, I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And there again, there's another little pebble that's added to the ripple effect of God's grace. Because Boaz is blessing Ruth and saying that I want God's blessing to be upon you. Little did he realize what that meant, but he's adding to it. And he goes on to add a whole lot more. And I want you to think about it. As a kid, when the beautiful picture was gone of the still lake, I would pick up a handful of rocks and just chuck them. And all these little pebbles hit, and all of a sudden there were ripples everywhere. And that was just something I like to do. But now I take the biggest rock I can and throw it in, but that's a different story. But as we look at the Bible, picking up in verse 13, it says this. And this is Ruth responding to Boaz. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have standing, or the standing of one of your servant girls. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Even if she gathers among the sheaves, do not embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her. Verse 17, so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and then she threshed the barley that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. I want to stop right there because ephah is a great word to stop on. I'm going to tell you what ephah means and how much it is, but in this story we're getting this picture that the ripples of God's grace have to begin somewhere. And they don't begin big. They usually begin with these little things that happen. But as they continue to happen, and as others are added to them, God's grace continues to grow and to be seen and to be shown to people. And we all have that part. You know, the initial ripple of God's grace in all of our lives is the fact that he gave us the faith to believe in him. That's where it all started with you and with me. We saw the reality of who Jesus was, and we accepted that. That was the initial thing. But from that point on, it's up to us to do our part, to add to it. Naomi let Ruth return to Bethlehem, and I talked about that. And then Ruth was determined and willing to go with her. And then when she got there, she was willing to work. And her hard work was seen and reported to this man Boaz, who was the owner of the field. And he added to it by continuing to bless and to add grace to what was going on. Because he didn't have to let her be in his fields. He could have kicked her out. He could have said, you're not wanted here. You're not even an Israelite. Go away. But he didn't. He showed kindness. He showed compassion. And especially when he found out who she was, he wanted to do it all the more. And as we look at this idea of working hard and letting God's grace be seen because of it, and that was one of the big points from last week, we need to understand something, and that is the hard work of living on mission, sharing God's grace, always pays off. It will always pay off. Naomi and Ruth had no idea that her hard work to try to support them, to try to provide God's riches for this pair of widows was going to pay off, especially in the way that it ended up paying off. They had no idea it was going to happen. But Ruth said, I'm going to do what I can do, and I'm going to do it hard. Think about it. If you look at this chapter, it says that she worked from early in the morning till late in the evening. And then she said, okay, I'm bushed. Someone else needs to take care of all this stuff we gathered. No, it says that when she got done with the work of gleaning and gathering, she went and she threshed it. If you know anything about the old way of threshing wheat or barley, it's not an easy process. It's a very time-consuming and very energy-consuming process. You either took a stick or a rock and you literally beat the barley to break it open, to separate the chaff from the kernels, and then you throw that in the air and let the wind blow the chaff away, so all you had was your barley when you were done. She not only worked all day, but then she worked into the evening to share this blessing, God's riches, with her mother-in-law. And that hard work always pays off. It always will. We might not see it, but we should never doubt that if God has called us to do it, it will pay off. And that brings us back to our missionary story. Remember, we were looking at that picture of a 1,000-seat cathedral in the middle of a jungle, and out of that cathedral had come churches in every one of the surrounding villages, and God was blessing, and they were growing in incredible ways. Well, it all started back in 1912. In 1912, a man by the name of William Leslie decided to take advantage of a medical mission that he was qualified for. He was a doctor, and he was getting to the end of where he thought he could be super useful, where he was, and he thought, God loves me, I need to share God's love with people. So he decided to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1912. And he went to this area, and he actually set up it took a number of years to clear an area where you could set up a medical mission in the village of Vega. And he set it up there, and one of the biggest challenges setting it up and clearing the land was making sure the workers didn't get killed by the local leopard population, which was thriving for some reason. But they finally got it cleared, and this new mission station was there perched on the edge of the river. And yet, one of the other challenges they faced in that area, which is kind of unique for Africa, in that area there happened to be a bunch of the villages were still practicing cannibalism. So it wasn't safe for him to go out and share the gospel. He just had to set up shop and hope that people would come to him. And he continued to serve in that area of Africa for 17 years. We're going to put a pause on his story because that 17 years is a lot of hard work. When you think about clearing a jungle by hand, fighting off leopards without the use of modern rifles, and keeping the cannibals away, there was a lot going on. And if you read his story, they had to deal with lots of things. Some of the army ants that can travel through Africa were one of the things they had to figure out how to defend against, which is, if you don't know how, it's pretty much impossible to stop them. But then they figured out how to do that. They survived, and they went on. And yet there were these challenges. Do you keep working in the face of challenges, or do you stop? We have to understand. I want to go back to that idea that hard work for God, doing what he's called us to do, be on mission by sharing his grace, always pays off in the end. And a missionary felt he should go, and all he had was medical missions. Maybe he could take care of their physical needs, and when they came, then he could tell them about God. I have a question for you, for me this morning. What is the one thing that God keeps asking you to keep doing? And don't think it's to move the mountain, because remember, it's just one small pebble that starts the ripples. What is the one thing that God wants you to do to share his grace, to share his love with someone? Are you faithfully doing that? Day in and day out. Year in and year out. Or as in the case of our missionary, decade in and decade out. Are you faithful to do what God has asked you to do? So often we get bored with the little things and we go, God, I want to do something big. Think about Ruth. She could have given up. Okay, I worked half the day. I had some stuff. I just got fed by the guy who owns the land, and I have some leftovers. I should call it quits and go home now. No. Keep faithfully working till the end. Keep faithfully working until you've accomplished what you set out to do. And you'll be amazed at what God can do through your faithfulness in the little things. It's always the little things. We have to remember we can't pass on what we don't have to begin with. So, are we being faithful in the little things? If we're talking about God's riches at Christ's expense, have you accepted that yourself? Not just heard about it, not acknowledged it, but have you accepted it and do you apply it to your life? Can you say that God calls you one of his children, one of his sons and daughters? Not do you call him God, but does he call you son or daughter? The way that I like to phrase it, that you guys have all heard dozens of times if you've been here for any amount of time, is, how's your relationship with God? Don't ask to be sent on a mission field if you can't have regular devotions and you're not growing with God every day. It's not going to happen. Don't ask to have the privilege of leading your family members to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ if your relationship doesn't mean anything and make a difference in that. We have to be living it out before we can pass it on to others. How is your relationship? The starting point is to make sure we've received that relationship. And you hear me at the end of every service talk about receiving Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. I stress that because growing up, I only heard people talk about Jesus wants to be your Savior. He doesn't want you to go to hell. And no one ever talked about Lordship, so I never understood it for the longest time. God isn't, this might sound kind of odd, but God isn't interested in punching your golden ticket so you can get into heaven free. He doesn't care about that. Because it's not about getting to heaven, it's about having an eternal relationship with him. He wants to be your Lord. Where he is in control of your life, he's letting it turn out the way he wants it to be because it'll be better than anything you can imagine. Are you willing to let him be Lord of all? Because until he's Lord of all, you can't pass him on and share that grace with anyone else. And so we have to start there and we have to go there. But it's interesting, as we do that, this idea of being on mission and passing it on actually brings us to the second point that we're looking at today. And that second point is simply this: the ripples of God's grace spread with faithfully doing what is at hand. And we've been talking about that. We've been looking at the idea that we must stay true to doing what God has given us. What is that one thing that he asks you to do? Well, I did that for a while. Why did you stop? I got bored. That's the wrong reason to stop. I got tired. That's the wrong reason to stop. Think about Ruth. She worked in the hot sun all day as a stranger in a strange person's field. Yeah, she was getting a little bit of kindness, but she didn't give up. She didn't stop. And when the work day was done, she went to work. so that she could take home what she gathered and show it to her mother-in-law, because that was the whole idea. I want to pass on God's grace, what God's given me, to my mother-in-law. That's what Ruth's motive was. She wanted to pass it on. But the only way it was going to happen is if that faithfulness in doing what was at hand was there. Are you faithful with what God has given you now? Are you doing it on a regular basis? We already read it, picking up in verse 14. It says, at mealtime, Boaz said, come over here and have some bread. And oh, here's some roast grain. And all of a sudden, God is giving Ruth more grace. She didn't deserve to sit at the owner's table, so to speak. It was probably a picnic blanket to the table. She didn't deserve to sit there. She didn't deserve his food. That's the whole point of grace. We never deserve it. God just gives it to us. And think about it. If you go back and look what it says she was sitting there, and then when she... in verse 14, at the end of verse 14, it says, when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roast grain. The very last sentence of that verse. She ate all she wanted and had leftovers. She ate all she wanted, all she needed, and she had stuff left over. And she said, great, it's all mine. You know, if we go on to read the rest of the story, she takes those leftovers after she's worked a full day and then worked some more. She takes the leftovers and said, Mom, we have dinner. And she gave it to her mom. Because God's grace is never about us. It's about what we can pass on to others. So when God blesses you in life, when you see a little bit of that grace shining through, do you go, great, now I can finally do what I've always wanted to do if I ever got some mad money, some extra money, some crazy money? Or do you go, God, how do you want me to use this to bless someone else? Because if we're in the business of letting those little pebbles drop into the water and the ripples start getting bigger and bigger, it's about what we can pass on to other people, not what we can keep to ourselves. Boaz was adding to that grace. He said, stay in my field. And then at lunchtime he said, come eat and keep the leftovers. It's no big deal. I have plenty. And then when she got up to work, he actually did a whole bunch more, because instead of saying, treat her like a foreigner and one of the poor and destitute, which she was technically, poor, destitute foreigner, he said, take care of her. Watch over her. Provide extra for her, and don't rebuke her what she does, because she's trying to pass it on to someone else. So we see all these pebbles starting to fall into the water, and these ripples of God's grace getting bigger and bigger and more plentiful. Ruth also continues to work hard to receive that grace, and she went back to work and worked until evening, and then, as I said, when her gathering was done, then she went to work again. It was like second shift. And she went and she got the barley ready, and it was amazing what God provided. You see, we have to do something really important, and that is we must stay faithful while on mission of sharing God's grace. If we give up, it could be right at the moment that someone's about to receive it for the very first time. It isn't about the results we see happening. It's about our obedience to God to do what He wants us to do. We must stay faithful while on mission of sharing God's grace. God uses the faithfulness in the little things to impact others and eternity. I want you to think about it. The littlest things you do for God could have the biggest eternal impact, something you couldn't even imagine. Amen. Let's go back to our story about the missionary. Dr. William Leslie, he had just set up his medical mission, and he was surrounded by cannibalistic leopards, just man-eating leopards, and he was surrounded by cannibalistic villages, and he was trying to reach them with the love of God. Well, once a year he decided he was going to cross that river, and he was going to go visit villages that never came to him. And he knew they didn't know the Bible. He knew they didn't know how to read. But he would go, and his opening, that opening bridge to meeting the people was to take care of their sick and their injured. And that would give him opportunity. And as he was doing that, he'd spend a month each year traveling to do this. 1 month a year for 17 years, he would do the same thing. And he would teach the Bible by passing on by what isn't common in our culture, but is common in just about every other culture, by oral tradition or the telling of the stories of the Bible. He'd pass on the scripture. And the people would learn and hear and understand. But then he also realized if they really want to know the Bible for themselves, I need to teach them how to read and write. And so he started an education program to teach people how to read and write. And he talked about the importance of education, and he continued to talk about the Bible. And Dr. Leslie started the first organized education system for these villages, and he continued to do this for 17 years. Do what's at hand and be faithful with doing what's at hand, even if you don't see results right away. Even if you don't see what you want to see, are you doing what God has asked you to do? It's amazing how many people come to me and say, Pastor Rob, I'm saved and God was using me here. What can I do next? I said, are you done with doing that? Well, I don't know. Well, has God told you to quit? I don't think so. Then keep doing what God told you to do. Don't look for the next big, exciting thing. Be faithful in what He's given you, and it'll turn into the next big, exciting thing. Amen. Don't look at jumping ship and running somewhere else. Be faithful with what He's given you. Because you see, that's actually our third point. And that is simply this. The ripples of God's grace magnify over time. They always get bigger. If we go back to our story, I want to pick up in verse 17. We already read it, but I want to read it again. Verse 17 says this. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and then threshed the barley that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much that she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave to her what it was left over after she had eaten. Her mother-in-law asked, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Ruth told her mother-in-law all about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today was Boaz, she said. Verse 20. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and to the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it'll be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Did you see the ripple effect as it got bigger in Ruth's life? And it's a picture of life for us. As we receive God's grace and we stay faithful, the effects and the impact of God's grace as we share it get bigger and bigger and bigger. But we have to faithfully do our part. Ruth brought back not only the leftovers from her meal, but she brought back an ephah of grain. You might be going, what on earth is an ephah? Well, it's roughly equivalent to 5 gallons of barley. I want you to think about that. 1 day's work, and she brought about the equivalent of 5 gallons of picking up leftovers. That's not leftovers. That's a blessing of God. Because if you cook the barley down and you prepare properly, that's about a week's worth of food. And so, in 1 day, God provided a week's worth of food, and it was going to continue until the harvest was done. I want you to think about that ripple effect. All of a sudden, these two widows who were the bottom of the food chain in the economic chain, so to speak, who had no hope because that was their lot in life. That was what life had dealt them as their husbands had died. And Ruth was a foreigner, so she was even lower down. All of a sudden, God had taken their worries about how they could survive and said, you have more than enough to survive. Because if this is 1 day's worth of work and you already have a week's worth of food, after 5 days worth of work, you have over a month worth of food. And all of a sudden you have too much food so you can pass it on to other people. Do you see how God's grace is rippling out in this story? You see how it's continuing to spread? God's grace is never meant to be a temporary. It's never meant to be temporary, but an ongoing solution for what people are dealing with. I want you to think about it. So often people go, okay, God loves me and he wants to take care of this situation, and they think in the here and now, and it's over when the situation is dealt with, and that's shortchanging God. Because God never wants to just deal with the here and now. He wants to deal with the ongoing and the eternal. That's what God's grace is all about. So God's grace might temporarily deal with the situation, but the ongoing solution of God's grace will continue to take care of life in general. And that's what it did for Ruth. The ongoing provision was for Ruth. A guaranteed daily harvest, the ability to provide for Naomi and others. But there's also, Naomi mentioned it, there's also protection for Ruth because of being a stranger, a foreigner in that land and being a widow. All of a sudden she had the protection of Boaz and his men as opposed to what other people might do to her. And not only that, but this ongoing blessing, this magnifying getting bigger, all of a sudden Ruth had a built-in source of companionship with the other servant girls of Boaz. Because she got to hang out with them all day. And you know what? When you work with people all day, even if you don't like them at first, you'll learn how to get along with them. And there's usually at least a couple people you start to get along with. Because that's the way relationships work. And so God gave Ruth a support structure. Friends, protection, provision for her and her mother-in-law and then other people as they had need. But we tend to stop short and sell God short in regard to his provision and his grace. We go, okay, God, it was just enough to handle this, that's all there is. And God's going, what are you talking about? That was just the first twist, opening the faucet so that it could just keep gushing. And right now there's only drops coming out. They're the kind of dirty drops, and you're happy with that? It's better than what I had before, God. I'm good. And we tend to do that. We need to accept what God has for us and not give up. So often we don't think we're worthy of the grace of God. We're just worthy to be around God's grace, to see it, to get a little sample of it, but we're not worthy of the fullness of God's grace. Yeah, you are. Jesus said you were worthy when he died on the cross. And he said the fullness of God's grace is there for you to pass on to others, but you can't pass it on unless it's flowing through you. So the fullness of God's grace is to be flowing through you. Are you willing to let it happen? Let's go back and wrap up our story about the missionary. Leslie spent 17 years at Vega, and once a year for a month traveling across the river to try to be a testimony to these villages. And in those 17 years, he saw no converts to Christianity. In fact, at the end of 17 years, his stay in Africa ended because a bunch of the village leaders on his side of the river got upset at him. And they said, we don't want you here anymore. Will you please leave? Talk about feeling like a failure. You just spent 17 years of your life trying to show the love of God to people, teach them the Word of God, and you're being kicked out by them. Well, they made their plans to leave, and fortunately, before they left, the village leaders came and said, we're sorry, there's been a mistake, and we don't want you to leave. But at that point, he said, no, I'm leaving. I'm going home. And he came home feeling like a failure. And for 8 years, he continued to live feeling like a failure. And after 8 years, he died feeling like a failure. He never got to see the ripple effect of God's love as it spread. But from his death, now if you figure he went in 1912 and he was there for 17 years, so math, 1929, and then he went back home, back to the States, and he lived another 8 years, so that's 1937. He died, and it wasn't until 2010 that the ripple effect was seen. But all that time, the ripples of his love and what he did in sharing the grace of God with these people continued to multiply and bump into each other. And the waves got bigger and bigger. And without anyone leading them, they built that cathedral. And then the cathedral got so full that they couldn't house everyone, and people were walking too far, so they built other churches. And this whole Christian community in the middle of the jungle was there because of the ripple effect of God's love. Because one man didn't give up the entire time he was there, even though he didn't see any positive results. how easy do we give up? How soon do we throw in the towel saying, oh, must have made a mistake. God didn't want me doing this. Well, if God called you and you knew for a fact that this is what God wanted you to do, why would you let anyone stop you unless God himself says it's time to stop? Keep being faithful. Keep doing what he's called you to do. You see, we can leave a huge legacy by living on mission and letting the ripples of God's grace magnify over time. We might not see it ourselves, but we will see it. I could tell you missionary story after missionary story of missionaries here in the United States and around the world who had similar experiences. They went, they failed, some of them were killed and discarded in the river for the crocodiles to eat. Talk about a failure. They didn't even make it home alive. But 30 years later, when a missionary returns to that area, the doors are wide open, and the missionary finally says, why? He goes, well, we had this prophecy that a messenger would come and his blood would stain the river red. But his message would be true, so the next one who comes bringing the message, we should respond. My dad was able to see part of that because he's one of the missionaries who came and replaced one of these missionaries who died. And he was able to see the fruit of their labor that they never saw because they died and they got eaten by crocodiles. But my dad was able to see revival break out because of what God did, because that ripple effect keeps growing and magnifying. And some of you are here today because of that ripple effect. All of you are here today because of that ripple effect. People sharing God's grace, and it grows and grows to the point where you cannot deny it anymore. You have to give your life to God. And who knows what God can do through you and me as we join this great movement of living life on mission and sharing God's grace with everyone we come in contact with. It will magnify over time. It will spread throughout this community, throughout our families, throughout this area of the country, and around the world. If you want to hear and read a fascinating story that illustrates how one church has a ripple effect that goes around the world, read the history of the Moravian missions movement. It started in one church. And that church was having communion, and God called them to prayer like they had never prayed before. And for 100 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there was constant prayer in this Moravian church. And thousands upon thousands of missionaries. This church is in a community that's only about 800. But thousands upon thousands of missionaries came through this church and were sent out and impacted the globe. Because one group of people said, we're going to keep doing what God has called us to do, and we're not going to stop. 100 years of constant prayer, 24 hours a day, by one little church. And God touched the world because of that incredible ripple effect. As we wrap things up this morning, I want to ask you a simple question. Are you part of God's ripple effect of grace, or are you standing on the sideline? Because God doesn't want any of us on the sidelines. He wants us to step up and be part of what he's doing. As you think about that, I'm going to invite you to bow your heads and close your eyes.